Alrighty, so this will be a real treat. As I mentioned, we've spent, this group is a couple hundred people who kind of work at the intersection of real estate and technology, and we thought it would be timely and important and interesting for all of these folks who work around real estate to actually talk about what's going on with housing and particularly in the Bay Area, but elsewhere, given it's such an important issue at the crossroads. But before we go there, would love to just hear a little bit about your background, maybe even prior to your current role. I know you worked a bit in tech and now work in public service, but love to hear more about you.
Sure. So lawyer by background, used to practice civil rights law and was a criminal prosecutor. I'm glad I don't recognize anyone from those days here. Spent 10 years, started a political CRM company. Started in '99 until I was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in beginning of 2009. And part of why I decided to run for office was I saw San Francisco as a city and our region as not necessarily as supportive of a lot of the innovative cultures that all of you represent. San Francisco, when I ran for office, we were hitting the Great Recession. We were the only city in the state that thought it was smart to tax the payroll of innovative startups, and we were also the only city in the entire country that thought it was smart to tax the stock options of startups. And when I ran for office, I ran in part wanting to reform some of that stuff, which we did, and proud of the fact that during my 6 years as president of the Board of Supervisors, we created over 100,000 jobs, many in your sectors, in San Francisco, and were able to right-size our budget. But part of the impact of all the economic growth was we have in recent years created anywhere from 6 to 10 jobs for every unit of housing that we've built in this area, and that is part of the reason why we're here talking about housing and homelessness.
Yep. Maybe before we get to the housing topic, I'd love to hear just kind of more from a macro perspective. What are the big issues in Sacramento, apart from housing? What are the other things that the State Assembly is thinking about and working on? And I guess as you think about advocating for your constituents, what are the big topics for you?
So I would say, so I chair the Housing Committee, and obviously that is an overwhelming conversation, and we'll spend more time talking about that. I think in the Bay Area, a twin problem is transportation, congestion, the failure of public transit as the ability for folks to get around and enjoy your lives rather than sitting behind the wheel of your car. Clearly, the quality of education, the need to improve our schools, the need to educate the next generation of your workforce is something that we spend a lot of time talking about. By the year 2030, it's estimated California is going to be about 1.1 million college graduates short to meet the job demands of our economy by that time. So, huge challenge. And then, as a Democrat, I will say we spend an awful lot of time trying to protect California from the terrible things that Donald Trump is doing to us. So whether it be how he's trying to go after a lot of the civil rights protections of our diverse communities, our immigrants, our workforce, our LGBT community, women, our environment. I could talk for a couple hours. That's another topic.
Well, I will suffice by saying thank you for your service on all of that. Okay, so let's get into housing. You touched on it a bit, but I mean, clearly there's I'd love to hear just your sort of first principles about what you believe are the root issues with housing in the Bay Area and California at this point.
So I'd start, first principle, there's this thing called the laws of supply and demand. There's a lot of demand, and we ain't building the supply. And I start with that because that is not a foregone conclusion when it comes to the housing debate, as I'm sure any of you who read the papers know. There are lots of folks who don't think that we need to necessarily figure out that. In the state of California, it's estimated we are about 3.5 million units short to balance the supply and demand curves. To stabilize our housing prices, our rent prices, that is what has been
And just for reference, that's probably what, 10-20% short relative to the number of households or population?
Good question. That is my guess. It's probably somewhere between that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite a shortage.
So it's an enormous shortage. There are many reasons for the shortage. I would start with everything from the fact that we haven't been building. Well, why haven't we been building? Because a lot of cities and our constituents, in many instances, are kind of fine with how things are. People like to talk about the character of their neighborhoods, the character of their cities, the character of their region. They don't want to change that, which has led to a lot of laws that are in place that are often viewed as hindrances to building housing. So whether it be impact fees for every door that you're trying to build, whether it be ways in which certain types of, say, the Environmental Quality Act are used, and people sue on that, whether it has to do with the shortage of investment that we've made in affordable housing. Those are challenges as well. But you add all of this up, and then again, the failure of cities, and I would say a lot of policymakers to really address this question. You get the perfect storm that we're in when you add, say, another 500,000 jobs that the Bay Area has added in recent years without building any housing whatsoever. I represent San Francisco. You're in my district. Welcome, by the way. In my district, we were the epicenter of the state housing crisis. So 5 years ago, we were tackling this here at the local level and starting to see the record home prices, eviction rates, levels of homelessness that you see today. When I first went to Sacramento in 2014, I asked, what are we doing about the housing crisis? And a lot of folks blank stares, literally like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then, a couple years later, when you're seeing hepatitis A outbreaks and E. coli outbreaks in San Diego and the Sacramento Delta, when you see homeless encampments in Orange County, Skid Row in LA, farm workers who are unable to be housed, who are literally sleeping in the fields, when 1 out of 10 public university students in the UC system, in the Cal State system, in the community college system are effectively homeless. They are sleeping in their cars, taking showers in the school gym, sleeping on their friends' couches. We have a crisis of epic proportions. And so I spend probably 40% of my time as a legislator really thinking about big picture.
Before we get into possible solutions, and I know you're an advocate for many bills and many solutions to the problems, how, I guess, in Sacramento, do you feel like there's universal acknowledgement of the crisis and universal support for finding solutions, or is there still, debate as to whether the situation is as acute as you just described it?
So, quick answer: yes and no. So the yes is everyone agrees there is a problem.
Yeah.
No, there is not enough consensus on what the solution is. And maybe I'll dive in for a minute. So in the last few years, there has been quite a bit of consensus around a set of solutions that I'll refer to as the 3 Ps. The importance of protecting millions of Californians from being displaced from their homes, which is driving homelessness. The importance of preserving affordable housing, or ensuring that we have enough housing for working families and lower income Californians. And then the third P of production, of building the 3.5 million units that we're talking about. If you ask different constituencies, different folks will focus on one of the 3 Ps, but not all of the 3 Ps. And I've been trying to proselytize this idea that we have to do all of it, that we can't solve the crisis piecemeal. We have to protect people in their homes. We've got to address the affordable housing crisis. We've got to build more housing, including market rate housing, because there's a school of thought that we should only build housing for the lowest income Californians. So moving forward on all 3 Ps. The challenge, and this alludes to my no answer, is again, certain constituents say yes to one, no to the others, and so on, and that is what creates the juggernaut in politics.
Got it. Can you talk about, so I was chatting with someone, I don't know if John Deshotsky is in the room, but was chatting there on break, and John, by the way, was calling you the rock star of housing policy in California. So
is that Bono?
You have many fans out there, at least one in John. So can you talk about the various bills that you've advocated for, and I guess what do you believe the specific solutions are to the problems?
So again, it's, as I say, it's all the above. So when it comes to protection, this year the legislature, for the first time really ever, passed a major tenant protection law, which was a law that I'd authored, which would establish a rent gouging cap in the state of California, as well as provide tenants with some predictability as to why they're being evicted. Really the first time tenants ever received
Is that
protections like this.
AB
AB
1482?
1482.
Got it.
It was something that we worked very closely with all of the industries that were involved to establish, from the building industry to realtors to the apartment and landlord world to tenant equity groups, labor organizations, to make sure we're hitting the right balance. The law basically says, on the one hand, landlords are able, if we were trying to strike a balance between providing tenants with some predictability on rental increases and allowing landlords to receive a fair rate of return. And so the law as of January 1st says for some properties in California, increases in rent cannot be more than the consumer price index plus 5%. So that's roughly 7.5% to 8% a year, which most professionalized landlords will tell you is enough to make profit, but is obviously short of the 20, 50%, 100% rent increases that we've been hearing about. So that's the gist of the protection side. On the preservation side, this year in the budget with our new governor, we invested a record amount of money in trying to build more affordable housing, over $2.5 billion that are going to low-income affordable housing production, as well as homeless services. So we're trying to move forward on that front. On the production front, I will say this year was a bit disappointing. The major bill in that area was my state senator's proposal. So Senator Scott Wiener proposed SB 50, which would have significantly rezoned around transit and job-rich areas, as well as eliminate single-family zoning in the state of California. It got held in one committee by one committee chairman. I believe the bill will likely move forward more significantly next year. I think it's an incredibly important part of the conversation, not the only answer when it comes to production or the housing crisis, but we've got to build more, and we have to build more next to transit and jobs.
Got it. I'd love to come back to a couple of those, but maybe first on 1482. So, sorry, you described it as the I know it's rent capping, but what was the anti-rent gouging?
Rent
I think is the way,
gouging, right.
rent gouging. So I remember going all the way back to my college economics class. Rent control was kind of held out as the an example of something that seemed good on paper, but like the smart economists would feel like it actually would suppress build out of housing supply, which ultimately, is a part of the solution, right, to figuring out supply and demand imbalance. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on how this bill will help expand supply, or just what do the economists have wrong, or what are they missing?
So I'll say a few things about it. Whenever I talk about the rent gouging bill, I always say that the long-term solution has to be to produce more housing.
Yeah.
I also distinguish between rent gouging and rent control, and I know those words are often described interchangeably in the press.
Yeah.
But we have cities in the state of California, over a dozen of them, that have rent control. So in San Francisco, rent cannot be increased year to year more than, say, 1.5%. And I think most economists would look at that number and say that is a number that could, in the long term, stifle production. Yeah. Whereas allowing landlords to increase rents anywhere from 8 to 10% a year is more than what it costs them to take care of their costs and to make some profit. So I would say that CPI plus 5% or 8 to 9%, that is not a level that I think would have the same economic effect as the 1.5%. Now, that being said, I have been supportive of rent control here in San Francisco because it is the only policy we've had in decades that has protected some level of economic diversity in cities like San Francisco. It's not perfect for the reasons that you just said. I'm the first to admit that. Yeah. And my hope is if we can build enough housing, someday, hopefully, we don't need any of these policies. Yeah. The rent gouging policy that I mentioned is only going to be in effect for the next 10 years. And so the thought, hopefully more than wishful thinking, is that we're going to build enough units over the next 10 years to stabilize the market so that this law doesn't have to be extended. We'll see.
Great, thanks. How about the build out of units? What do you think is, I guess, where are we now and where do we need to be on building more supply? And what do you think are the forces that will drive more creation of supply?
We need to build, I think I said 3.5 million units, so
Yeah.
an awful lot of housing. And it's really hard to do this because, as I said before, communities don't like to change even though they see the drivers. And those of us that are pushing for more production, we're essentially pushing to address the needs of our future constituents who do not exist today. So in other words, our constituents who all live here, they all have homes, and they're all fine with their views of the waterfront, and they're fine with the single-family zoning that they may live in, and they're fine with the neighborhoods as they see them, and there is concern about what it means to build a little bit more densely, what it means to build with a little more height.
Questions from the audience?
Let you.
Yeah, I think Mike coming around to Mike. Mike for Mike.
So you talked real quickly about rent control, but I didn't hear you hit on what I like to call the original sin of the California housing crisis, which is Prop 13.
Yep.
And are we ever going to be able to get it out of the way so people will sell their homes? We'll have more inventory?
How much time do we have? So I think everyone knows what Prop 13 is. On the one hand, Prop 13 has done a bang-up job since the 1970s at helping certain people be able to live in their homes. It was intended to help seniors who were seeing their property tax rates skyrocket. But over the past 4 decades, we have seen several intense, horrible, negative, unanticipated consequences. Our property tax base, which used to be the base that funded our schools, basically cut in real dollars our funding to our school system by over 40%, which means that we used to have one of the top 10 funded and top 10 performing school systems in the country. We now are bottom 10 for funding and rank probably 36 as far as performing. But a different unanticipated consequence that I think all of you appreciate is because of the cap on property taxes, local governments, cities, local city councilors, former supervisors, have to rely on other forms of being able to collect tax revenue that incent commercial development. And so what that means is mayors and city councilors around the 400 cities in California are not looking to build housing because they don't get money for building housing. They would prefer to build the strip mall, the shopping center, the office, and that incentive doesn't work. Now, I'm going to issue a challenge to all of you. I would suspect that if you are not already supportive of Prop 13 reform in this room, if you knew more about it, you probably would be. It has been the real estate industry that has presented the most significant opposition to changing Prop 13. For reasons that are self-interested, right? You're capping property interests, property taxes, but in the long haul, it's very detrimental to California. So, my 2 cents.
Other questions? Yes, John?
Yeah, please keep playing the hits. You're a rock star. So
You're going to get me karaoke singing.
we have, yeah,
Now we're talking.
we have entitled a project using SB 35 in downtown San Francisco.
Which one?
It's 457 Minna, 270 units, 50% affordable. It'll break ground next year. Very excited about that project.
Great.
But the returns barely work because of the 50% affordable. Is there any plan to augment SB 35 in any way, shape, or form, or are you trying to tackle the production just through SB 50 in the coming year?
So there has already been SB 35 cleanup. Everyone know what this law is? So SB 35 is a law that my good colleague Senator Wiener passed 3 years ago that essentially said that if a city is not building enough in certain RHNA categories, if you know what RHNA is, regional housing needs assessment. If you're not building enough housing that you're told by the state you need to at the market rate level, at the workforce middle income level, at the lower income level, then projects that are focused in those areas can be streamlined and can happen faster. I was a big supporter of SB 35. I'm glad to see it moving projects forward. There have been SB 35 tweaks. There probably will continue to be SB 35 tweaks, so happy to talk more if you have good ideas on that. But one of the things you said I just want to mention, affordable housing requirements, so-called inclusionary requirements that say the developer has to include 20% of their units to be affordable to certain folks, or 50%, et cetera. Sound good on the surface, something I have supported throughout my career, but we all know, as you know, there is a tipping point at some point at which a developer can't make a pencil project out, and a project pencil out. And unfortunately, many of our constituents view developers as bottomless pits of lots of money. And so it is a very popular thing for a city councilor to say, we want more affordable housing, 50% affordable, knowing full well that if you peg that level of a requirement on a developer, nothing is going to get built in the city of, say, Cupertino, hypothetically. And so we have to think carefully of how we push developers to build as much affordable as possible, but not kill the goose that is trying to lay the housing eggs. So long-winded way to say this is all stuff we're monitoring, and we are looking at cities that have used inclusionary requirements as a way to basically shut down housing production.
We have time for maybe one more question from the audience over there.
In Texas, I read about the anti-rent gouging law as rent control.
Mm-hmm.
And
again, it's all semantics, right?
Yeah, of course. No, and I really appreciated your explanation. I hadn't heard the details, but I'm curious of just one specific question. What do you say to the property owner who could be getting the 20% per year rent increases? And you know, I would view it as their right to do so if the market can bear that. But what would you say to them as to why it's not fair for them to be getting the market rate?
So this bill, we spent a lot of time working with, negotiating with the property owner world of California and frankly in our country and investors in that property. And the quick thing that I think we would say is these industries have made significant bank in recent years, have done very, very well. And we're essentially asking folks to cut back a little bit of what their profit margins have been so that we're not seeing skyrocketing homeless rates and people who have lived in their communities for a long time are able to live in them. The other thing I'll say to provide a little context, last year on the state ballot, there was a rent control measure that many of us supported because we needed change to happen, which your industries fought tooth and nail, spent $120 million to defeat. The justification for the measure was Sacramento has done nothing to protect tenants in decades, and there was a movement to move forward what most would refer as real rent control. As soon as that measure failed, the proponents to that measure proposed a measure for the 2020 ballot. And essentially what they said was if Sacramento didn't act this year or doesn't act at all, it's more reason to pass what would be viewed by your industries as more and real rent control. And so the law that we put out there was one that we think addressed the most egregious rent gouging happening around the state while allowing for a fair rate of return from your for your investment. So it's a balance. And we'll see how it plays out, but I will say that our bill was not opposed by the California Apartment Association that represents this world of property owners and landlords, was not opposed by the Building Industry Association, was supported by the California Business Roundtable and the Silicon Valley Leadership Group and the Bay Area Council that represent corporate California, because they know that if their workforce is being pushed out of areas like the Bay, either they're going to move to Texas or they're going to be driving 3 hours a day. Tenants and workers need some level of protection. It is all balance. If that's my last question, can I make one last point? Or
Please. I was just going to ask a final question, if it's all right, of just, with a very influential group here, one might say titans of industry, what can we do to help the cause, both in our personal lives as civilians, but also in our roles as leaders in the business community?
So to the titans of industry, we need you to lean into this conversation. We need you to lean in every facet of the conversation. And I will say the following. There's a stereotype when it comes to the titans of industry, that the titans are looking to maximize profit and to make billions of dollars off the backs of everyday hardworking Californians who are struggling to make it in a state and a country where 40% of Californians and Americans can't afford a $400 unexpected hit at the end of the month. So when that rent goes up by 15%, while some might say, well, that's just the free market, others will say that is the difference between someone being able to live in their home and being forced out onto the street. And so I would ask you if we can all work together, if you could work with us to help us create opportunities to move forward on all these fronts. I appreciated that the industry trade associations that I just mentioned didn't oppose the bill because they know something needs to be done. And they know that if there's a chance of moving forward production bills like SB 50 to build 3.5 million units of housing in high transit and high job areas, and to eliminate single-family zoning so we can build more multi-unit apartments, to have a shot at that, we have to give tenants the thought that they may be able to stay here too. It is a balance. And so I need all of you to help lean in, and not just you as the CEOs, the C-suite folks of your company, as I was the CEO of my tech company, by the way, so I know this world a bit. We need your employees. We need your workforce. We need those of you who know that if we can't solve the housing crisis in the Bay Area, for example, you're going to have to move your workforce to another part of the country, or your competition is going to eat you for lunch. And so would ask you to be involved. This is a world I was invited, happy to come. I've not really engaged with your world. I'm the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee. I don't really know what you're focused on, but would be happy to learn more. Let me just close, though, by saying the following, which is, as a Chinese American, there's that Chinese character for opportunity and crisis. It's the same character as I think we know. We are in crisis, but there's an opportunity because I think a growing number of Californians know we need change. And if I had one song that I could actually sing in front of you, that I would say, it would be the song Journey, which is Don't Stop Believin', because I do believe that there are enough well-intentioned folks, smart people in the world who know what enough of the solutions are, that if we all row together, we can build all the units of housing we need. We can hopefully see and eliminate homelessness on our streets. We can prevent folks from being evicted, and we can allow people to achieve that California dream, that American dream that we have all looked for.
Awesome. Assemblymember Chiu, thank you so much for your service and for being here today.
Thanks.
Fantastic.